Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Game Changer. I'm Maryam Zia. Tonight we'll be diving deep into British government's recent decision of redefining extremism and its implications. Of course, when we talk about this decision, how this is going to be impacting not only the Muslim communities in UK, but of course around the globe, we will be exploring in today's program and how this decision might be setting a precedent for other Western countries of the world. And there is also a looming threat that, of course, this redefinition of extremism may also be equating it or confusing it with other legitimate advocacy campaigns like for the rights of Palestinians, and how important this is to separate the two. In today's program, we will be also exploring about the recent grown attacks on Muslim communities. Of course, when we look at the figures, around 337% increase have been seen in Islamophobic attacks on Muslims in different countries. What are the ramifications of this decision to redefine extremism? We will be exploring in today's program, and how important and significant it is for the global community to create a consensus on this definition of extremism, so that it does not impact the civil liberties of the people. And of course, the target is only on the extremist mindset and extremist ideologies. What it holds for the UK and for the global community, and how Muslim communities are going to be viewing this, its ramifications on advocacy campaigns, we will be exploring in today's program. To discuss this and more, we are joined online by Barrister Sara Belal. She is the Executive Director at Justice Project Justice Project Pakistan. Welcome to the program, Sara. Let me start with the very basic question. How do you view this decision after a long debate? And of course, it has sparked a lot of debate and controversy around this definition or redefinition of extremism by the British government. What do you make of this?
I mean, I think we're seeing like a paradigm shift all over the world, especially in the backdrop of the Palestinian conflict. We are seeing more and more persons fighting or actually challenging what was, the publicly held view before in terms of the Palestinian movement, and we see governments in those states actually having to adjust. So, this latest definition of extremism that's been, decided or released by the Secretary Michael Gove, you can see that this is the British government kind of trying to find their way around the issue of how they're going to deal with these mass protests against a very unpopular policy.
Right. So, do you think that this is more of politically motivated campaign rather than actually addressing the issue of extremism in the UK?
So, I mean, look, I'm not an expert on the UK, but I mean, the law in general is always political. And the law is always used and wielded as a political tool, but it's also wielded in response to whatever is assigning. And I love any instance in which you see the law be used, because that also means that it can be reversed in the same way or challenged in the same way. So I mean, this is just and again, laws coming into power, or examples like policies like this, with attempting to define, this is a give and take between the government and human rights actors and the public, and then it's a back and forth in which they settle on something. So yes, this is a reaction by the UK government in the backdrop of these mass protests that have been taking place. And you can see their attempt to actually move it. I mean, how is it harmful? Is it a step forward? Is it a step back? I think that there are two important distinctions over here. Number one, this is an attempt to define extremism, right? And they're moving away from the previous definitions of what they had, which was, to looking at terrorism offenses. And extremism here is based more on ideology instead of actual action. So it allows for a wider net to be cast in terms of who decides and how it's decided what is an extremist ideology. But at the same time, if we look at our own country, we see in our own political context, starting from 1997 until the present day, you see our own government trying to attempt to do the same thing with our Anti-Terrorism Act, right? And I would very much like to also focus, when we look at other countries, we should also be looking at what we are doing in
Right,
our
of
own
course.
backyard, and what are the steps that we need to take to improve our own laws.
Right, but Sarah, at the same time, don't you think that terrorism and of course extremism are very subjective terms, and attempting to redefine it is going to be having consequences? And how do you see it on its impact on freedom of speech, and of course its impact on advocacy campaigns, human rights of course campaigns? Do you think it is going to be impacting those as well, because since it has moved from action to ideology, and that is a very subjective term?
Absolutely. And the law tries in its best of times to be as objective as possible. But I love instances like this in which the law reveals, or the actors or the powers that be reveal how intensely subjective the law is, no matter how much it tries to be objective. But our goal always should be that you try to have objective tests within the law that can bring some kind of reasonable decision to come to bear, or the process through which a decision is made should be as, it should at least attempt to be as objective, and this clearly is very subjective. However, again, I come back to an example that says, and of course, this again, when you've outlined the political backdrop against which this policy has come out, right? So, and it's also what's very interesting to me, it's by the UK Community Secretary and not from the UK Home Department. And it's not very clear to me, is it the cabinet or who's the one that decides, on what is declared an extremist group? But it is really meant to actually, from what I can read about the law, it's really the effect of it is that it's going to place, number one, greater emphasis not on actual acts of violence, but it's looking at ideologies. And then how do they sanction the groups that they would be designing as, or labeling as extremists, would be to basically cutting them off from receiving any government support or funding. So that means a lot of the pro-Palestinian groups could technically fall under that if it's decided that their ideology, for example, there's a very big backlash to this ideology or this even chant from the river to the sea.
Right.
That's considered by some quarters to be extremist. Now, who gets to decide and how? And in fact, if you look at the recent background of the UK government, you see them trying to clamp down and even arresting a lot of Jewish people who have been joining the pro-Palestinian movement, saying that that's an extremist ideology. But again, I would like to point back to the steps that we need to take to ensure what our major law, we don't have an extremism law as yet, but we do have a counterterrorism law that's been in place since
Right.
1997. And
Right.
that
So,
law
right,
needs
right.
to be reformed in line with the Supreme Court's judgment that says that our definition also needs to be improved and Parliament must act on it. And now, the reason it's become more important is that Pakistan is a signatory to the ICCPR, right, which is a convention on civil and political rights. And we get reviewed by the UN on our application of that treaty every 5 years. Last time, 5 years ago, when we got reviewed for the first time in 2017, the committee specifically formulated a recommendation to the government that we need to bring our definition of terrorism and amend our act in line with our Supreme Court direction. Now, we have the next review coming up in July of 2024, this year, in a couple of months. And the committee gives an initial list of questions that the state has to answer to. And in that list of questions, which is a list of issues, they have specifically singled out the application of the Anti-Terrorism Act by saying, what are the practical steps that have been taken to amend the definition to bring it in line with our own Supreme Court's decision. So these are
Right.
really important things that our
Right,
state needs to
right.
do to
Very,
make
very
them look
important points highlighted by you, Sarah. But what would you recommend that what should be included in this definition of extremism? And then we will be coming back to the point that you raised earlier, that when we talk about terrorism as well, of course, this is a very subjective terminology. And when we look at the history, we know that the definition of war on terror has led to destroying the countries like Afghanistan and Iraq as well. So what impact does this new definition of extremism is going to be having
I'm
specifically
not.
on marginalized groups?
Yeah.
Um,
So I'm not a big. That's a good question, but I'm not a big believer in new definitions and new special systems to deal with special scenarios. I mean, I've been trained as a criminal lawyer, and I don't even agree that there is a need for a terrorism crime or a definition, because the criminal law can actually adequately try. But whenever you create these new regimes and these new definitions, that's just meant to control and deviate from the actual crime that takes place. So again, this definition focuses on ideology and not on acts, right? And it's eroding that basic principle that criminal law has, that has been in place for centuries in common law and otherwise, which says that every crime constitutes two elements, which is an actus reus, which is an act, and an intention. So you have to have both elements. Now, all of these definitions, whether it's terrorism or extremism, and the problematic ones like in our act and even this one in the extremism policy or whatever that they've come out with, tries to use and to erode that standard that is sacrosanct in criminal law. So it tries to do, either they focus on the act or they focus on the intention, but don't have two together. So I mean, for me, all of these are efforts to actually go away from what is at the heart and soul of our criminal justice system and in the common law, which is you need both elements.
Right, right. And Sarah, what would you recommend, that what are some of the elements that should be included if we redefine or define extremism? Because
I
of
don't
course,
think
if
you need. I don't think you need something that says extremism. I mean, you have
right,
plenty of legislation that
right,
deals with
but at the same
freedom of
time, if we
speech and
look.
otherwise.
Right, but Sarah, at the same time, if we look at the recent legislation, there are also reports that some of the groups, and mostly Muslim groups, have also been labeled as extremist groups by the British government after this redefinition of extremism. So ultimately, this is going to be impacting advocacy campaigns and advocacy groups, and specifically Muslim communities. So do
So
you
it
think
shouldn't
that there
exist.
needs to be a consensus on this definition, or we need to be having some laws or international laws? Because as per this definition, maybe ICJ is also an extremist organization, because it was actually listening to the case of Palestinians as well. So this is very
The
complicated.
ICJ is a so the ICJ is a court. It's not an organization, and so it cannot fall under that definition that's been made. Courts are set up under a different statute, usually under a constitutional mandate.
Right,
So
I'm
that
just
it's
trying
not
to
an
make a point
organization.
that the broader definition, that if they are going to be criminalizing some ideology, then of course such advocacy campaigns or such cases cannot be even heard, and people would be afraid to raise their voices on different issues. So do
So
you
I
think
mean,
there needs to
so
be
this
a law or
definition,
consensus?
I I think this needs to just be challenged, right, as a policy. And it's very important to understand that even this policy that's come about or the law that's come about, it doesn't actually criminalize groups. It's just saying that we will be designating them as, extremists, and that leads to a set of different actions that the government can deny or take, right, with respect to supporting these groups. But having said that, like I said, it shouldn't exist and it should be challenged. I don't think trying to work with a framework that is inherently flawed actually works. And those are specific, I mean, especially when you come to special regimes like terrorism or extremism. We have seen after 24 years of the war on terror that those frameworks have categorically failed in every respect. So, as a lawyer, I do not, I believe in challenging those fundamental frameworks, because we've seen that by amending them or trying to fix them for 24 years has not led to any change. They're impossible to fix because of all of the considerations. So the time is to challenge them. So my answer to your question would be that this definition of extremism should absolutely be challenged. It shouldn't be allowed to exist in this policy. The policy itself should be challenged.
Right, of course, this should be challenged. And in your opinion, how does this definition or the broader earlier definitions of extremism intersect with the broader counterterrorism strategies and policies? And what needs to be done in regards to that? Because there is a lot of intersection in extremism and terrorism.
Right. So, I mean, I think if we talk about the broader counterterrorism policies that have been adopted by a lot of the states, including our own, they need a proper review to see why and how are those regimes effective in any sense. I mean, have they actually led to stopping anything? Have they led to, you know, and how many cases of wrongful convictions or, getting the wrong people they said? I mean, that's what needs to be analyzed. And once that is analyzed, you know, truly, with the right intent, can you then go back and see, okay, well, do we need to have this regime anymore? Somebody could come back and say, playing devil's advocate here, that absolutely in a country like Pakistan, you need the Anti-Terrorism Act because in cases of terrorism, there is a high chance that the witnesses will resile or won't turn up in court. And so therefore we need this special regime that allows for us to try terrorists because they can't be tried in regular criminal courts because nobody would testify against them. Okay, that's an argument that we can debate, that how many terrorists are you actually trying by the anti-terrorism court, and how many regular murder cases are you trying by the anti-terrorism courts? And if you're going to ask for these special protections like section 21H, or that that erode the regular due process that we accord people in our criminal courts, right? Like the right to have a confession admitted against you. Sorry, the police can actually record your confession, which is not allowed in a regular criminal court. Have these led to any major cases, or on the overall, how much have the erosion of these rights actually led to any benefit, right? So, I mean, I think for all Western governments, the UK did the same thing at the height of the war on terror. They were designing special courts and national courts that were, most of the evidence was in secret, and, special counsel had to be appointed that could, appear in those courts. I mean, all of these regimes now need to be revisited, right? Now that the war on terror has gotten slightly a bit cold, not that hot as it was, all of these decisions that all these nations took, including our own, need to be revisited by seeing, does it actually serve a purpose now? Does it serve a purpose, or does it do more harm than good?
Of course, a very important point raised by you, Sarah, that does it serve the purpose or not? But are there some lessons that we can learn from other countries, or in that regard, are there some frameworks or policies in any country of the world that could be replicated in other parts of the world, or still we need a consensus to develop on extremism and terminologies like terrorism?
Right. So that's a good question. So, I mean, actually, there are other policies. I mean, we've done a very good job in our own country, being one of the countries with the highest number of casualties under the war on terror, as the government of Pakistan has said at many fora, right? This is an issue that is very close to our own hearts, and it plays out in our background, in our own backyard, right? So for us, the steps that we need to look at are the steps that our own Supreme Court and, in fact, the UN Human Rights Committee have outlined for us. If we can just even show practical steps to revisit our definition of terrorism under the Anti-Terrorism Act, if we can show a study that we've done, or if we can promise that we will start a study from now, and then we can say to the committee when we appear before them, look, we're thinking about it. Here are some practical steps that we've taken to actually analyze what the Supreme Court has said to us, and we're evaluating the situation. That puts us on the right path. Nobody expects us to change our way of being in, even in 10 years, 20 years. But we need to show that we started thinking about these issues, and we've taken some practical steps that say that we're not just blindly following something that was written down in 97 and has now, been expanded to include, my God, the Anti-Terrorism Act basically allows for everything to be tried under the act, which leaves no room for actual terrorism offenses to be tried under the act effectively. So let's just start small. Let's look at our own case. Let's look at the directions that the Supreme Court has given us and the Human Rights
Right.
Committee that's given us. And let's focus on making those changes, small changes, to bring our laws better aligned with protecting our citizens. Because at the
Right.
moment, the way the act is, it doesn't protect.
Right. And lastly, Sarah, what needs to be done to prevent the misuse or abuse of these anti-terrorism or extremism laws?
The definition needs to be amended in line with the Supreme Court's directions and the Human Rights Committee. You do that, and you review the two other provisions, which is 21H and the admission of a confession against you, and some due process concerns, and you would have largely fixed 80% of the problems of the act. Begin with amending the definition in line with the definition suggested by the Supreme Court, which lays down a threefold test. And the test is, number one, that it should be, the Supreme Court held in this case, which was reported in 2020 but decided in 2019. It says the Supreme Court held that in order to classify an individual as a terrorist, there must be three things. Number one, an actual act of terrorism. Number two, the intent to commit an act of terrorism. And three, intention to advance an ideological, political, or religious cause. So that's the threefold test of three elements that must be present in order for us to classify someone as a terrorist, is what needs to be amended in the act. We do this and we're on the right path.
Right, right. Thank you very much, Barrister Sarah Belal, for joining us in today's program and for your valuable input. And now we will be moving ahead and we'll be discussing other dimensions of extremism and what needs to be done to create global consensus. And to talk more about it, we will be joined by Syed Irtiza Shafaat, but we will be taking a short break here. Welcome back. We are talking about the redefinition of extremism and its broader implications. And to talk more about it, we're joined online by Syed Irtiza Shafaat. He's Professor of Political Science and Philosophy at Foreman Christian College, and he's also a doctoral researcher at the Center for Public Policy and Governance. Welcome to the program, Irtiza. So we are talking about this recent decision by the British government to redefine extremism. First of all, tell us, what do you make of this decision to redefine extremism, and how do you see its implications on advocacy campaigns, especially on the Palestine issue?
Ever-changing setting in the world, in a postmodern world, maybe new definitions are required, but possibly the legal ramifications of once you institute a particular definition, it assumes a rationality of its own, and if I may, so to negate or destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms. So they want to stop that, right? And that is a cornerstone of the British parliamentary Westminsterial process. On the other hand, undermine, overturn, or replace the UK system of liberal parliamentary democracy, right? And rather than getting into the nitty-gritties of the legal ramifications, I think here this merits a discussion about the standard of liberal parliamentary democracy as it is practiced, and its wide-ranging meanings. In one sense, in the real world, as most academics suggest, for example, terrorism, even extremism, is an essentially contested term, right, which can mean
True.
different things to different people. So on the one hand, people who stand against, for example, the oppression against women, or who are intolerant towards men because women are being oppressed, for example, right? And in that context, but we must keep this in mind, that they are linking intentionality with conduct. So there
True.
is the right to state what you want to state, but as long as there is no
Action
consequential
taken, of course.
utilitarian action, exactly right. So there is a focus on that. I guess in the political context, what it might mean is because with the elections, which might happen in 3 to 4 months or at max in a year in England, maybe the right wing Tories are, trying to whip up that kind of reactionary sentiment in a way, in a bid to silence pro-Palestinian protesters on the one hand, and they also talk about far-right groups on the other hand. But we must remember that in the previous election, Jeremy Corbyn had to face a lot of vitriol, and it was a key election issue that he was tilting too much towards the Palestinian cause,
True.
which did damage his electoral prospects, and maybe
Right,
because
right, but
yeah.
it might be a politically motivated decision to trying to redefine extremism, because the previous definition that was given by the British government in 2011 was focused only on the actions, but now it is focusing on ideologies. But don't you think that this politically motivated decision is going to be impacting the societal cohesion at large and is going to be targeting Muslims at large?
Well, we have to, in a way, understand that this fault line has been existing ever since 9/11, and
True.
it is this kind of global antagonism which is persisting in a way, and it's not like British society is completely cohesive or a monolithic category, if I may use the term in a broad sense, and there are fault lines and fissures, simmering tensions within the society, especially amongst immigrant communities, which, to be fair, I mean, if you look at the ISIS vibes, which again, the Tories, for example, stirred that up and played that up a lot. So there have been some instances which can then become like a problem for the majority, which is a uh, silent majority in a way, especially amongst the Muslim immigrant communities who are peaceful people and who accept the liberal democratic ethos. And in a way, they might be cornered, which remains a question in history with the application of the law. But we must also understand that uh, it's a developed democracy where procedures are transparent and the application of law is relatively fairer as compared to the developing world. So
Right, right,
it's yeah.
but Irtiza, what steps are being taken to address extremism in the UK and when we talk about at large across the globe? Because there needs to be steps taken to actually address the issues that are actually driving the extremism.
Absolutely, absolutely. As we discussed in the previous program as well, there are those deeper kind of global issues, antagonisms, which maybe require consensus and tolerance of the other, and need to be resolved through deliberation, negotiation, and debate on a global level as well. And that's the challenge, because we cannot look at England in isolation in any sense. This is a global phenomena which requires dealing with, and the Pakistani government also has been dealing with it. And over time, I hope we are able to develop some kind of consensus through which we can find actionable mechanisms to finally deal or combat this menace.
Right, but Irtiza, how can we have an holistic approach in dealing with extremism instead of just focusing on the terminology or redefining these terms like terrorism or violent extremism?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you look at contemporary sociologists or political scientists, for example, just the mere idea that there is any kind of universalism in the world is being questioned, right? Because of the cultural discrepancies which have emerged and which have also existed, which make any kind of operationalization of universalism and imposition from above. And we can see that in the foreign policy overtures of the US government, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, which exacerbated terrorism rather than solving terrorism. So there
True.
are wounds as well, historical sense of woundedness amongst these communities because of the imposition of force in the name of, under the garb or the veneer of liberal democracy or exporting democracy, which has added, which has complicated the issue even further.
Right, and how serious are these concerns that other Western countries or democracies can be following the footsteps of course, the British government in regards to this extremist mindset, or focusing on the ideologies, and what impact it would be having on civil rights movements and other grass root organizations that are working for different rights, who are just voicing their opinion on different issues?
Again, that then I cannot say like across the board there are so many movements, grassroots movements with various kinds of motives and objectives, and it's tough to generalize across a broad spectrum of resistance movements which are active in Western Europe, for example. And every movement has its own dynamics, for example, and requires tending to. But the left-right kind of divide, I think, is important in the British context, because it's the Tories right now, the right-wing, center-right, conservative Tories in power, which is why this issue is becoming even more, it's people are getting scary because the right wing is in power at this point in time, and because of their I would say distrust of the Muslim immigrant community in a way. We have to
Right,
remember that Muslim
and the
immigrant.
reason behind, right, Irtiza, and the reason behind that distrust might be the significant rise in, of course, Islamophobic attacks since, of course, October 7th.
Yeah.
And of course, there is 337% increase on Muslim attacks in Muslims only within UK. So of course, those communities and also other marginalized groups are feeling threatened. So do you think that civil rights movements and other grassroots organizations can actually play a role in, of course, shaping a discourse on this regard?
I am sure. I trust the civil society in Britain to speak up and contest this on all appropriate forums. And there is this whole kind of even if it's a liberal bourgeois kind of democracy, there is an open space. Let's face it, for dissenting opinion, and the amendments which are being suggested do not silence. I mean, in a way, it's a paradox, because they're trying to protect free speech by limiting, certain terrorist strands or extremist strands in a way. So, and that in one sense is one of the paradoxes of democratic behavior in the world, where you can have, via democratic procedures, you can have movements which assume an anti-democratic character, for example, the kind of thing that Wendy Brown or Nietzsche talk about, for example, right, which is a possibility. And I think it is because of the hate mongering and because of the Palestinian issue that this has become even more charged. But for the situation on the ground, from my friends and academics in Britain, the things have gotten really checkered since November and after the Hamas attack.
Right, October 7th. So, do you think, Irtiza, that there is also an intersection of multiculturalism and, of course, national identity surrounding this redefinition of extremism, or this is purely a political decision, or a decision that is purely politically motivated?
I think it's for me too early to say at this point in time. I would see its application in practice and then be clearer, because the wording and the text, right? It's been worded by clever people with acumen. So and it's not internally consistent logic if we think about it, but it's the extra legal political dimension which is the problematic bit in this.
Right, but at the same time, do you think that there would be some resources or support given to the individuals who might be unfairly targeted in response to this new definition of terrorism, extremism?
I'm sure there will be modalities and mechanisms available. In one sense, I haven't gone through the whole text, but they talk about not letting them have government patronage or government access on the one hand. So the ambit is rather limited in one sense. But so, for example, when they say attempts to radicalize, indoctrinate, and recruit others to an ideology based on violence, hatred, or intolerance, including young people, I would reiterate that with the ISIS incident, for example, we should have an open heart to understand that there have been groups who have been supporting, who've had violent aims in British society, misusing the name of Islam, for example. And so, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir recently got banned as well again. So there is that element. I can't. It's a complex issue, if I may
True.
add.
It's still
Yeah.
complex at this point in time because it is it has sparked a debate not only in UK but across the world. But lastly, Irtiza, in your opinion, what needs to be done? What steps should be taken to ensure that the fundamental rights are upheld after implementation of this new definition of extremism?
I think the onus is on the civil society and people working in the grassroots, and especially the opposition as well, to continue raising a voice in appropriate forum in the parliament, for example. This will obviously be debated on the floor of the parliament as well. Sometimes when we're looking at England, we look at it through the Pakistani lens, right, where the parliament unfortunately does not have the agency or is not taken as seriously. But people there vote based on moral stances taken by their politicians in their constituencies, which sometimes went against party lines, for example. So in one way, in one sense, it is an enlightened society in a sense that they are connected with the parliamentary process, and there is a knowledge of government mechanisms. But on the other hand, Brexit happened as well, right? And that is ample evidence that that kind of far-right anti-immigrant hate is an objective thing in England as well.
Right, so only time will tell its ramifications. Thank you very much, Syed Irtiza Shafaat, for joining us in today's program and for your valuable opinion. Of course, we talked about extremism in today's program, and when we talk about such subjective terms like extremism or terrorism for that matter, there needs to be a broader global consensus. That's all from Game Changer tonight. Take care. Allah Hafiz.